Hello everyone, this is Robin, and this is going to be a video response to vergak, Vergak, about my gender journey with being autistic. So, I was assigned female at birth, and I was raised in a four-person household. My brother was born shortly after me, um, 2 years later, and so I grew up with a brother, and I uh, I didn't notice a whole lot of there were differences in the way that the two of us were raised. I I was encouraged to like things like American Girls. Um, my mom and I read through a lot of those books together, and I was encouraged to play with Barbies, and I was encouraged to play with dolls. Um, and my brother, he played a lot more with stuffed animals, and he played a lot more with. He was a lot more physically active, and a lot. Um, he was allowed to be, I believe, a lot more physically active. Um, you know, I remember. I don't actually remember because I was too young, but I know that my parents told a lot of stories of whenever I was a young child. I would climb up on things and I would throw myself from them. and there were several stories my father told me about. I would climb up on rocks, or I would climb up on things, and then I would hurl myself at him and say, "Daddy, catch me!" and and I'm not sure if gender played a role, like, subconsciously in their minds to reprimand me from doing that, or or if it was primarily like, "Dear God, let this child have some chill." um, but but I remember them telling stories about, like, Robin would be very physically active, and then we told them to stop doing that. so so from the first point that I have memory, um, actually my very first memory is of someone telling me, "No, don't do that." uh, and so I grew up, and I was a very reserved child. I think I think even at the point when I first developed long-term memory, I had already internalized some of those, like, self-restrictions in me. So that's everything that I can remember. Is growing up, um, living with a lot of self-restriction. I was very concerned with the rules, and in my early life I was very well behaved, and I was because I was well behaved, and because in society, um, obedience in children is considered a sign of maturity. Um, Even though later in your life you realize that those self restrictions in early childhood, and those ways that you were seen as mature, were actually a form of immaturity, because you were not given the space to self develop, and then because you were not given the space to self develop, you then had some delays, or you had some difficulties in interacting with your social age group. And I did have a lot of difficulty interacting with my social age group, um, girls or boys. I My mother commented a lot about how I was the quiet child who wanted to sit with the adults instead of playing with other children. And around other children, I would keep mostly to myself. I I grew up not really having a lot of age group friends. Uh, but yeah, I would be the child that would sit beside the adults, which were usually like the moms in any social gathering. I would sit beside the adults and I would listen to their conversations, understanding that I was not invited to partake in these conversations because they were conversations um, of adults to other adults. So I felt privileged in a way to be allowed to just sit and listen, because by sitting and listening and not commenting, I could glean information that was not otherwise accessible to my age group, and therefore um, I learned a lot of things kind of out of step with my peers because of that. I learned a lot of seemingly adult things um, very early, and that also lended itself to the illusion of maturity. Um, what else was I going to say? I just had a thought. I so then I also remember a comment by my parents about how I would keep things internalized and I wouldn't volunteer them until there was a particular thing. I don't remember what the question was, but my parents told a story about whenever I approached them asking a very specific question about how something in the world works. And what they said was, this question came out of the blue. Like, they had no idea, one, where I got that information, and when they thought about it, they thought back to like weeks and weeks ago, and they realized, oh, they were sitting right there whenever we talked about, to another adult, whenever we talked about this particular thing. That had to have been the conversation where they picked this up. There was no other way. And then, the cogs start turning, and they're like, oh my God, Robin has not only did they notice that this one thing in this conversation, not only did they take notice, but they understood what we were saying enough to take notice. And they had been thinking about it for weeks, meaning I had been thinking about it for weeks. And I had thought about it enough to bring a specific and very pointed, like very, very detailed question where it was obvious that I had put a lot of thought into this question and into this subject matter. And yeah, my parents like to tell that story to brag to other people, other adults, and they liked to do that a lot. So I grew up kind of with that. Like, my parents were they they were proud of me, or they were very keen to tell these stories to other adults about their child, about how smart their child was, uh, but always with this air of confusion or awe, or just like, what do we even do with this child? I was always kind of bamboozling to them, and I think because of that, just constant bamboozlement, um, that I don't know, maybe my neurotype affected how I was um, more drawn to like ideas based, listening to the ideas based conversations of adults, rather than like um, rather than like immersing myself in the like swing set social social dynamics, because like in swing set play or something, and like playground play with other children, thinking back about it, I notice that a lot of the playground play is a grounds where um, children are expected or just sort of naturally run into by proximity, by having to share a space with other children. You kind of naturally learn the social dynamics of how to share and how to cooperate. And it's very like you run into emotions there. The first emotions that you run into, frustration, or like, I want that, or that's mine, conflict. Those first areas of um, learning how to be social happen there. And even though I did, play in the playground some in my early years, I also very quickly became tired of it. Whether because it was overstimulating. I remember spending a lot of time in the shadow, like underneath the playground, where I would play by myself in this space that I had found where no other children were. I would find the place where no other children were, and I would hunker down and I would sit there and I would create my little worlds down there, my imaginary worlds. Until, another child seeking social interaction, or seeking, like, being curious about what was I doing down there. So surely something must be interesting down there. Would come and try to interact with me, and then I would be like, nah, nah, bye. And then I would go sit beside my mother, and I would say, I want to go home now. I want to go home. um, but also things like sensitivity to light and noise, I think, also contributed to that. Being autistic, being very sensitive to sensory data. Um, that, and then also the social confusion of, like, I found a lot in my early years, I was very confused why other children acted the ways that they do. I was just like, what I'm doing makes logical sense to me. What I expected this to go a particular way because this makes logical sense to me, but this other child is acting in a way that I didn't anticipate, and I'm not certain how to respond to that. Um, and often that included, like, um, being angry, like, why are you angry? I don't understand. Or, like, why is there this? I mean, I was also a very uh, emotional. Uh, I developed emotionally a bit later, um, in my childhood. Like, I developed emotionally, and whenever I did, I developed emotionally very strongly. Um, a bit later in life than the, like, playground age. But from that early age, what I did have was a sense of justice. Justice. And a sort of pride in myself. I am engaged with what I am engaged in, and it is worthwhile. And anything that is outside of this, um, anything that is outside of my expectations of how things should go, is injustice, and it is unfair, and it is wrong. Injustice. And and looking at other children going, they're fighting. They're acting in bizarre and baffling ways. It is injustice. Injustice. And anyway, so that was like playground age, right? And then whenever I went to public school for the grades kindergarten through when? Fifth grade. Kindergarten through fifth grade, I was in public school. And it was in grade school that I started running into, like Vergak said, running into the more separation in social groups between girls and boys, and finding that I didn't fit into either of them. I didn't fit into either of these delineations. I I made like sort of friends. Like my friendships never lasted very long because I would approach someone with like curiosity or openness, and then we would run into a state of conflict, and then that state of conflict would inevitably like be too much for me, and then I would decide that it wasn't worth it. The states of conflict and the discomfort that comes from that is not worth it. I am far better suited. I am far more comfortable on my own by myself. I can get more things done. I can accomplish more that I want to accomplish on my own. Thank you very much. So, so my friendships never lasted very long, but I would kind of like float or hover between different social groups of both girls and boys. And I remember the girl groups that I tried to fit into. There were two major there were two major circles of girl groups, and one of them was the like highly social, probably extroverted, primarily girl groups of uh, there was a lot of focus on interpersonal relationships, is what I'm saying. There was a lot of focus on being more adult acting so that you could then fit into the society of how adultness is portrayed. There was a lot of talk about boys. There was some interaction with boys. There was a lot of social favor exchange between the girl children. I remember my mother told a story about I came home crying one day because a girl had promised to sit by me on the bus coming home from school. And then later that day, she had decided that someone else was more deserving or someone else was more worthy of her attention at that point. And like, and that it had been done in a very socially conscious way to snub me or to kind of distance myself from the social group or from the locuses of power and um, the locuses of power and social uh, alliances that she was creating, and that I was very hurt by that, and I didn't understand why she did this when I wanted um, to sit by her on the bus to talk to her or whatever. I don't remember what I wanted out of that interaction. Um, but I remember that I was very upset, and my mom said that I was that again I was like, this is not fair. I don't understand. I don't understand. um, there were other times that like uh, oh, so anyway, so back to my original thread. So there was the social group and social development girls group, right? That had a lot of nuance that I did not pick up on. There was a lot of nuance that I did not understand, and there was a lot of again that like uh, lines of social connection and lines of social control and social power. And I didn't pick up on most of that. Like I only picked up on it whenever I had already failed in some way. Uh, and then I would get that shunning and that distancing, and that was when I would realize that something was there that I didn't understand. Uh, and then the other girls group was the more bookish, the more introverted girls group where mostly they read books and drew and wrote poetry. And in fourth grade, this was the girls group that uh, that I joined in fourth grade. That for a little while I was a valued member of that group because I wrote poetry. Um, and I had read a lot of the same books that they had, and so then I felt for a moment that I had this like place in this group, this valued place, like, oh, okay, I can connect to people here. But then this was around the time of the Columbine shooting. Um, so for some reason, uh, the teachers saw this this introverted girls group. Sorry, there's a train where I live, so that's the noise. Um, but there's this. Oh, the teachers saw this introverted girls group that wrote poetry and read books about magic and fantasy books, and so therefore, like, called it magical. This was the budding witches girl group, the budding witches, and uh, saw this group and saw it as threatening to the school. Uh, that we had our private or our secluded by nature of being introverts, but we had our private little group of reading and drawing and writing poetry and saying that it was magical or pretending in that way. So we had an actual sit down with the principal and our teacher and some other administrative school staff where they told us that magic was bad and led to school shootings, and that we should stop this nonsense immediately. And I remember at that point, I was so hurt and I was so fed up with attempting to find value that I could contribute to social groups. I was so done and I was so fed up with trying to find what value I could bring to a social group and trying to connect to social groups that way, that after that meeting, the parents weren't even involved. It was just the principal and the teacher and the administrative staff telling us this, which in hindsight, I think was immoral and unprofessional. I think that my parents should have put up a bigger fuss. But at that point, after that, I was completely done with social interaction. And it was after that point in fourth grade that I started developing depression. And had depression, from then until now, basically, ongoing. And after that instance in fourth grade, I did not have any friends. I'd given up. And I decided, no, okay, so I'm not going to have any friends. Oh, back in like second or third grade, fourth grade, I had a little joining of a boys group around video games because I loved video games, and my mother had finally, in my mind as a child, had finally gotten us a Nintendo 64, and so I was having a lot of fun with that. I was playing things like Legend of Zelda and Mario Kart and Star Fox. And so then it was the boys that were talking about these things. So then I went to the boys groups and I was like, let's talk about video games. But a lot of the other things that they were interested in, and the boys groups were more focused on, again, ideas or shared hobbies rather than social dynamics. Uh, so I found that whenever they were not talking about the specific video games that I was interested in, sitting with the boys and talking with the boys was boring. So anyway, so jumping again back ahead to after that fell through and after the introverted girls group fell through, so I went into 5th grade feeling, you know, I developed depression. I felt extremely isolated. I did not even try at this point much to interact with other children my age. I remember I asked my mother to come and sit with me at lunch a lot because I was lonely. And I sat at the very edge of the table. I didn't really talk to many people. I ate my lunch quietly. I fell into a routine of I go to school, I study, I read in my downtime, I sit alone at lunch, and I go home. And really uh, the only social interaction that I got during that period was with my mother and with my brother, whenever we were both home. So my brother and I would play video games and, you know, uh, and along gender, because that's what this video is about, gender and autism. But as you can see with the different like gendered social groups, I didn't quite fit into any of them. And especially because I didn't fit into the girls group that was focused on social dynamics and relationships, I never formed that. I feel like a lot of feminine social dynamic and feminine socialization is fixated on very and feminine identity, feeling as if you are a woman. Part of that is that kind of solidarity feeling of having constructed and bonded closely with other women in a social context, often in the grade school, or at least starting there. So I didn't have that. I didn't go through that. So I got to 5th grade, and after 5th grade I was homeschooled. Um, my mother pulled my brother out of school, and because I was isolated and floundering socially, I begged my mother to please withdraw me from public school as well. I said, if you. Looking back, I noticed that my brother, because he was a boy, my mother took specific um, my mother took specific focus on him and his well-being and his education as if he was more important or more worthy. Also because he stood out in class a lot more, so his academic difficulties were more pronounced outwardly, whereas mine were extremely internal. And I would get good grades because I didn't have any extracurricular friends. I didn't have any extracurricular activities other than like playing with my brother. So, if you don't look very closely, if you don't invest a lot of focus in this girl child who is doing well with grades, on the surface it seems as if nothing is wrong because it was all inside of me. But whenever my mom pulled my brother out of school, I begged her to pull me out of school as well. And so she did. So I went through from 6th grade through all the way through high school to the end of high school, and I did dual credit, homeschool dual credit with a local community college whenever I was in high school. So that the social groups in the homeschool setting were a lot different than public school, not only because a lot of them were Christian, um, which coincidentally my family was not, um, but because of children were watched more closely, even even just in the sense of like their mothers or fathers had to bring them specifically to homeschool social events. So a lot of homeschool children in these groups with me, there was a wider age range and there was a more gender diversity and inclusion. All the girls and the boys would kind of like be together doing an event, which I found was um, I liked that. I liked that the cliques that happened in public school didn't really happen in a homeschool setting because there was already like 20 kids, yeah, like 10 to 30 kids at any given homeschool event. So there was already such a small pool that really everybody just kind of like went together gender wise and age wise and didn't really separate in that way. So I found that refreshing. But also because of that, uh, there weren't the the girl groups of strong social bonding, but there were boy groups that developed because then they started developing that like sense of masculinity, and a lot of masculinity is specifically focused and based on separating yourself from femininity. And the point of a lot of masculine traits, the point of a lot of masculinity is to be not woman or not feminine. So that was a really interesting dynamic that the girls' groups of like strong social bonding did not exist in the homeschool setting. Um, but the boys' groups did. And it was a lot less pronounced because these boys were often watched by their mothers. So while it was present, it wasn't allowed to develop into an overt thing. Uh, they were a lot more backhanded about it. They were a lot more reserved about it. They were a lot more like unconscious about it, or you know. So so I did for some times. I did kind of hover again, that hovering around the like boys groups because they were talking about things like Magic the Gathering, and they were talking about video games, and I was interested in those things. And if I could contribute relevant information or if I could contribute a fun game, then I was allowed to participate. Uh, I also found that I ended up playing a lot because my main social interaction was with my mother and my brother. I found that I interacted most with my brother's friends that were all boys. So I would talk to them about, for a short while. At the time it was comforting to me because it was the amount of social engagement that I could do. Was the amount of social engagement that I could do and the distance that I could handle, and then I went to my room and I was by myself. Um, I couldn't handle a lot of long-term social engagement, um, or heavily invested social engagement because I hadn't developed in me those social skills. And because I was autistic. So anyway, but my brother's friends were my brother's friends and not my friends. And for a while that distance worked for me in a way, but I was also heavily isolated and I felt lonely because I didn't have any of my own friends. So that was all through high school, right? And whenever I got to college, I was suicidal by this point. Um, I got to college and I was suicidal. And then, but of course, no one knew that I was suicidal because it was so internal. Um, but I lived on campus in a girls' dormitory. So that was another interesting thing about like I then was suddenly thrust into the girls' dormitory where luckily I was thrown in with like my roommate was another introvert, so I um um she was a a uh what is the word? Natural sciences major. She was very interested in plants. She loved plants, and looking back, it was kind of endearing. But she loved plants, and she loved science about plants. Um, and So she was a scientist, which I was not, and she was a black girl, and she was also an introvert. So with those three things, like I don't think that she very much expected much from me as as an introverted white girl, you know, who grew up socially isolated and did not know anything. And looking back, I was highly unintentionally uh, racist and like microaggressive toward her. And God, no wonder she didn't stay in the room very much. Oh God. But yeah, so that was college, at least the first year. Um, and God, but so we did not become friends, and that was unfortunate because I feel like that was mostly my fault. That was primarily my fault as an ignorant white girl, uh, not very socialized, uh, and very stupid. So, um, in the sense of like grew up in a conservative family. So, but anyway, so that was the first year, and the the rest of the my time at college, my depression grew to a point, and my I didn't know it then, but my um, complex trauma grew to a point where I had to seek I had to seek counseling, mental help through the school. And kind of through that, and kind of through wandering around all around the campus by myself because I didn't have any friends, wandering all around the campus, looking for new experiences, looking for something, anything, I wandered into um, several engagements with the queer community and like resources. I was developing a sense of feminism at the time. Of course, at the time it was cis white girl feminism, but I found something fulfilling in that, um, because I didn't know that I was autistic. I didn't have a sense of that I had depression or that I had PTSD. I just knew that I felt alone, and this cis white girl feminism was something, some connection to other people, some resonance of experience of marginalization and things being unjust. So through that, I found the gender and sexuality centers on campus, And I ran into, through feminism, I ran into, and the gender and sexuality centers on campus, I ran into queerness and a, a more nuanced understanding of gender. I realized I went then from cis white girl feminism to queer queer white non-binary feminism. I identified very much with the like non-binariness because I felt that I did not. If there was a time in my life when a gender install package was supposed to be installed in me socially, I felt that it was not installed. I did not get this thing. So so I identified with non-binariness and agenderness, and that's what I identify as now, is non-binary and at times agender. Um, and I guess it was only through it was through the queer avenues and the transgender and non-binary avenues that I developed. I discovered my first friends. I made my first friends. Um, Also, with another transgender, autistic, traumatized person, coincidentally enough. um, but yeah, through that, a whole bunch of other awarenesses arised. And but as far as gender after college, as far as gender after college, I with all of the resources available, not like there's a ton, but there's more information now. There's information available. There are resources, and of course on the college campuses, in the Gender and Sexuality Center, it is their job to connect you to resources. So running into resources about gender and about being able to make choices about your gender and your gender presentation, and allowing myself in that time a little bit more leeway to try things out and to identify as non-binary and to try new clothing and to try different um, outward expression. I found that binders hurt and I did not like them. And I did not care how it made my chest look. Although, my was just like, here, let me show you. But my I developed breasts in, I believe, second. I developed breasts in second grade. I was the first person to do so. And God, that was embarrassing to me at the time because I didn't fit into the, I didn't have that female social support or interest. I was just like, my body is changing and I hate it. I hate it. I have no one to relate to about this. This isn't fun. This is just a horrible experience all around. And my brother was like laughing about it, and my father encouraged him to laugh about it to separate himself from femininity. And my mother was just like, oh, well, these are the burdens of the feminine people. These are the burdens. And I was just like, y'all are not helping. Nobody in my life is helping this to be a positive experience, and I hate it. I hate it. I hate change. But I developed breasts in second grade, and I got my period whenever I was 9, and yeah, so I developed really early, and I'm a very curvy person. I have large breasts, I have large hips, and my body also collects fat, so I am I am fat. So, then, and these all become gender markers, outward gender markers. But anyway, whenever I got a binder, I realized that I hated binders, and I don't care if this flattens my chest. I do not care. It hurts. And although I liked whenever I got it completely on, I liked the pressure because autistically, I liked that like pressure stimmingness. Um, I really liked that, but it was getting it on and off that I felt like I was going to die each time. It was so frustrating, and it was such a sensory hell that I couldn't do it. I also got the first binder that I got, I also got secondhand, and it smelled like cigarette smoke, and I hated it. It was horrible. I hated it. So I never really was interested in binders ever, ever, ever again. And I'm still not. I just don't care. I wear bras. And I like sports bras better. Um, but at this point, oh well, I like sports bras. Um, Other gender things about like surgeries, top surgery, bottom surgery, that sort of thing. Testosterone, HRT. I thought about HRT for a while. I thought about top surgery for a while, for several years, actually. For several years, I thought about these things. And ultimately, I have arrived at a place now where I've gone through a lot of my emotional. I feel like for me, and not for, because I am non binary, right? And this is not the case necessarily for other trans people, but for me, because I am non binary and because I am autistic and non binary, I don't. I came to a point where forever things like top surgery and HRT I thought of as inaccessible. So ironically, because they were inaccessible, I was able to focus on them more, and I was able to vent a lot of my frustration with my life and kind of like being a victim of my life. Um, that's not how I want to say that. I felt that it was an avenue that I could vent a lot of frustration in my life of like, uh, I could waste a lot of my energy that way and self-defeat because it was not something that was accessible to me, and therefore I could just like endlessly hammer my brain against them, and I didn't ever actually have to dig deeper in my emotional self-awareness. I could just focus on that, and then that was a surface level thing. If I could, put the roadblock up and I don't ever have to think any further. And it wasn't until things like testosterone and HRT started becoming accessible to me, financially or otherwise, that I actually could think about it, allowed myself to think about it. And once I thought about it, I realized, oh, I just don't care. Oh, I don't want these things because I actually don't care. I only beat myself against them so hard because I wanted that outlet, because I wanted that frustration outlet, because I wanted that vindication or validation in my blockedness. And once I did a lot of emotional work, and once the financial means became available, I realized that I don't want top surgery anymore. And I don't want to go on HRT, at least not at this point in my life. Maybe whenever I'm older, um, maybe I'll surprise myself and I'll go on testosterone, you know? Who knows? But at this point in my life, there are other things that I want to focus on. I just have arrived basically at a point where I don't really care. And gender is not the thing that I want to focus a lot of my energy on anymore. And that's also how I relate to being non-binary. I'm out as non-binary at work. I tell people that my pronouns are they and them, and that generally I expect that to be respected, they and them, and that makes me comfortable. That helps me to feel like who I am and that other people see me as who I am. And to help people make that disconnect of like, I do not wish to be treated socially as feminine or female or woman because I did not receive that gender install package. I did not go through the cisgender female. I did not go through the cisgender female experience. I do not have that in me. I do not expect to ever have children in my life. I do not want to. I do not wish to I do not wish to receive the gender expectations that people try to give to me. No, thank you. You can keep that. It is not mine. So I am out as non-binary at work, and I do expect my pronouns they and them to be respected by people who know, but also in general daily life, in general daily society, people that don't know me see me as a lesbian, basically. They see me as female, but like there's always, of course, like they know that there's something, either it's the autistic thing or it's the queer thing, one or the other. They know that this is not woman, this is not a man, but this is not woman, you know. But they don't know what else to do or what else to call me, so then they say she. And in general daily life, interacting with strangers, I accept that. I'm not going to take the time. It is a waste of my energy to tell every single person about my gender experience. It's a waste of my time. But with people that do know me, and with close friends, and people who do know that I am non-binary, I do expect them to use my pronouns they and them. So anyway, it was a long video, but that is my gender journey as an autistic person. Thank you again, Vergak, for prompting me to make this video. Not specifically, but like, thank you for your video, and it inspired me. It was the train again. But yes, so I hope you all enjoyed this video or learned something interesting. That's been my autistic gender journey. Thank you for joining me, and have a great day. Bye!